Everyone. Good afternoon. Welcome. Thank you so much for being here. I'm Katherine Carlson, the Executive Director of the Rappaport Institute for Greater Boston here at Harvard. I want to start by thanking our partners in this important work, the Joint Center for Housing Studies, also at Harvard, the Cambridge Community Foundation, and the Cambridge Redevelopment Authority. This has been a true collaboration, and we're so grateful to have been in this together with you guys. At the Rappaport Institute, we focus on supporting work that is both rigorous and directly connected to the challenges facing our greater Boston and Massachusetts communities. And housing, as most of you know, in our state and in many places in the country is, of course, at the top of that list. We know why this room is full today. Today, when it's our first day of summer is what I was told, effectively, that you're all in this classroom with us to hear about this report. Massachusetts is tens of thousands of units short of what we need, and costs continue to outpace income across the region. And increasingly, the question isn't just about affordability, it's whether people can stay in the communities that they're already a part of. So what's exciting about this work is that it doesn't just describe the problem, it puts forward a different approach. How we might use redevelopment authorities as a platform to create mixed income, publicly supported housing that can remain affordable over the long term. It's exactly the kind of idea that benefits from both strong research and real world leadership. And so we're very fortunate today to have both represented here. It is my great pleasure to introduce Mayor Sadiki, Cambridge's mayor, and also, I will say, a current Rappaport urban scholar. So she's completing a mid-career master's with us here at the Kennedy School. But many of you know she's been leading on these issues in Cambridge, a city facing intense housing pressure while continuing to push forward affordable housing investment, zoning reform, and tenant protections. She brings a deep commitment to her community and a clear-eyed understanding of both the urgency and the complexity of this work. So please join me in welcoming Mayor Sadiki.
I feel like I should have a stool or something. Good afternoon, everyone. It's so nice to be here with you all. Thank you so much to everyone who was part of making this event possible. I want to thank Chris, Susanne, Becca, and the entire team at the Joint Center for Housing Studies for bringing us together, and to the Rappaport Institute, the Cambridge Community Foundation, and the Cambridge Redevelopment Authority for making this research possible. I want to also acknowledge my colleagues in elected office who have joined us today. We have former Mayor and City Councilor Mark McGovern. We have Councilor Kathy Zuzzi. We have Councilor Nolan. We have Councilor Sabrina Wheeler. We also have our state rep, Mike Connolly, who's been a leader on this issue. It's great to have you all here. And your presence really speaks to just how much this conversation matters in Cambridge and across the Commonwealth. I have to say, there's very few events when I walk in wearing so many hats. I'm a Cambridge kid who grew up here and benefited firsthand from our city's housing programs. I'm in my 5th term on the Cambridge City Council and my 3rd term as mayor. And as Catherine mentioned, I'm a Rappaport Fellow here at the Kennedy School. Each of those experiences has shaped how I think about housing, not as an abstract challenge, but as something deeply personal. Where you live shapes everything. Your access to good schools, to jobs, to community, to opportunity. I've seen that up close, and it's why I show up every day, and why my colleagues do as well, fighting to make sure Cambridge remains a place where people across the income spectrum can afford to call Cambridge home. We're here, and it's really exciting, and this report is really timely. At a moment when housing affordability is squeezing families at every income level, not just the lowest earners, but working people, young professionals, teachers, nurses, and longtime residents who built this city, it asks us a bold and practical question. Do we already have tools we're not fully using? The answer, it turns out, maybe yes. And that's both humbling and energizing, because it means we don't have to start from scratch. We have to be willing to look at what we already have and ask, are we using it to our full potential? In Cambridge, we've been asking that question more and more directly, and we've been acting on it. We've taken many meaningful steps to expand what's possible, from passing the affordable housing overlay, which allows 100% affordable housing to be built more quickly and at greater scale, to broader zoning reforms that have opened up the door to more housing citywide. Those efforts reflect a simple idea. When we face a housing crisis, we have to be willing to use every tool we have, and sometimes to rethink how those tools are used. Last term, my colleagues and I put forward a policy order to begin a real conversation about social housing here in the city. And as co-chair of the Housing Committee, I convened stakeholders, including our Joint Center and the Cambridge Redevelopment Authority, to start from the basics. What is social housing? And what could it look like? Who are the right actors? What does the public sector's role need to be? Those early conversations have been eye-opening. They reminded us that the path forward isn't just about building more units. It's about who owns them, who controls them, and who benefits from them over the long term. Continuing and deepening that work has become a central priority for me during this third term. My colleagues on the council agree, and we all recently came together to ask city staff to scope this work out formally. My office is now working with the city manager to form a joint task force that will dig into the key policy decisions. And I want to also acknowledge Councillor Al-Zubi, who is here, and Councillor Sabrina Wheeler, who will be working on this. And this joint task force will look into key policy decisions, develop concrete recommendations, and explore the full range of relevant tools we have and still need in order to bring social housing to Cambridge. That means looking at everything from community land trusts to state funding opportunities to the public agencies like our redevelopment authority that would play a critical role in making social housing a reality here. I'm really excited to dive into the contents of today and hear from our panelists. This is a wonderful example of how fortunate we are in Cambridge and Greater Boston to have so many dedicated stakeholders, researchers, advocates, practitioners, and elected officials who are willing to contribute their expertise, their perspectives, and their energy to this work. Just from the sneak peek I got, I know this report and this section on Cambridge specifically will serve us well and help us explore the questions we need to explore. It gives us a shared language, a clear-eyed look at our existing institutions, and a roadmap for what reform could look like. And today's report gives us a stronger foundation for all the work to come. It reminds us that our local institutions, our redevelopment authorities, were built with real power and real purpose. They have been sitting in many cases waiting to be called back into action. The question before us today, and the question we're going to take really seriously this term, is whether we have the vision and the will to direct the power toward the housing challenges of our time. I believe we do. And I believe events like this, bringing together researchers, policymakers, developers, and our community advocates in the same room, are exactly how we build a shared understanding and political will to get there. So thank you all so much for coming. I'm really excited about this panel, and thank you for having me.
Can you hear me? Yes. Can the people online hear me? No. Now, do we need to turn this off? I'm just going to.
No, you should talk into it.
Oh, I should.
Microphone's on.
But we have mics here as well.
Okay, so turn this on.
Can you turn it off? Hi, everyone. Thank you, Mayor Sadiki. That was a great framing. I hope we can live up to your expectations in some way. And it's great to see so many people here who we met in over 40 interviews online and just on screen. And now all of a sudden you're in 3D. It's great to see you here. So Becca and I will present key findings, or some key findings and recommendations from our research as a basis for the panel discussion. You can download the report if you haven't done so on the Joint Center website. We've structured our presentation in 5 parts. I will go through the motivation and briefly explain the origins and the powers of redevelopment authorities, when Becca will then discuss some of the examples of how redevelopment authorities across Massachusetts are already supporting housing and our key recommendations. This study was motivated by concern specifically over the lack of housing affordable to middle-income households. Oops, sorry, there is a nice graphic there, thanks to the Boston Globe, especially in high-cost cities like Cambridge, but actually across even lower cost cities in the Commonwealth. The three sponsors you already heard about came together and we jointly sort of came up with the research plan and hoped to find a way and question how redevelopment authorities specifically could make a difference in social housing in the state, in Cambridge, in the state, but also perhaps beyond. This is an issue that touches many states are facing these questions. Social housing made its first appearance in the United States under that term in 2018 and has seen just a wave of proponents and studies and proposals made by all types of supporters for asking for a new way to develop and design high quality, affordable housing for all. In the years since, social housing programs have been set up both within existing entities and in newly created ones. So just as an example, Montgomery County, Maryland has a county level housing authority, which is doing this kind of work. Seattle has just created a new entity to do it. To date, redevelopment authorities are not among existing entities who are doing this. And this omission was another impetus for this study. Massachusetts today has no comparable social housing program. However, the 2024 Housing Act allows for a social housing pilot. Thank you to Mike Connolly, who we just heard of. And the City Council, as we also heard, is exploring what social housing could be. Now, the elephant in the room question, what is social housing? So for the purposes of this research, we defined social housing as, first, serving a broad range of incomes. So unlike traditional public housing or so-called affordable housing. Second, using funding sources other than the low-income housing tax credit. And third, managed to maximize affordability over time through a public ownership stake. We do not prescribe income eligibility, so who gets to live here? And we also did not make any recommendations or prescriptions on how rent is set. Is it set according to income or according to another formula? But let's take a step back. What are redevelopment authorities? How did they come to be? And why are we exactly talking about redevelopment authorities when we also have housing authorities? That makes no sense, right? Well, redevelopment authorities and public housing authorities have a shared origin, but they have very divergent mandates. And yet they're both governed by the same law, which is Chapter 121B, which was enacted in 1952 and has been little changed since. Just as a refresher, public housing authorities are a creature of the New Deal. The 1937 Housing Act at the federal level empowered PHAs to build publicly owned affordable housing if that was tied to slum clearance, right? So here comes in the big other elephant in the room, eminent domain, right? Eminent domain allowed the Cambridge Housing Authority to build Newtown Court. Redevelopment authorities came about only after World War II. The 1949 Housing Act empowered redevelopment authorities to promote economic development by combating blight. This is a broader term than slum clearance. And the main goal was to stabilize property values and with that municipalities' tax base. This is a specific post-war problem among suburbanization. So hence we have these two authorities whose mandates were and are often considered at odds with one another. One has a mandate to provide low-income housing, but does not have the ability to operate as a real estate entity. The other has a mandate of maximizing real estate values without having to take into consideration the value of housing affordability. And this conceptual split in some way still characterizes these organizations. And one goal of this study is to reconnect these divergent mandates and see how that would work out. Across the state, cities and towns adopted urban renewal plans to make use of generous federal and state funding. But as we probably all know, concern over urban renewal grew. The federal program was ended in 1974, and yet urban renewal is still with us. Massachusetts continued to support urban renewal financially into the early 2000s, and today a unit within the Executive Office of Housing and Livable Communities approves municipalities' urban renewal plans, but it does not, there's no real money behind that. It's just approval. Today, that leaves us with about 30 active redevelopment authorities across the state. Some are standalone, as originally conceived, with an independent revenue stream and staff. Most, however, have been integrated into a city department due to a lack of funding or clear mandate. And as the mayor already said, redevelopment authorities exist. Why don't we use them? I'll give a brief overview now of the mandate and powers. As already mentioned, redevelopment authority's key mandate is to redevelop so-called blighted areas, which private enterprise would not do without public intervention. What you see here is an excerpt of the Statement of Necessity as written in Chapter 121B. So yes, even today, 80 years after this was written, redevelopment authority's mandate is restricted to combating, quote, substandard, decadent, or blighted areas. A second key thing to know is that redevelopment authority's powers are connected to active urban renewal plans. So these are plans that have to be approved by the state. These powers include land acquisition, including through eminent domain. An urban renewal plan must designate what is to happen with the properties within a clearly designated boundary. It has to be binding in terms of goal, but flexible to allow for implementation. So one key advantage redevelopment authorities have is that within this plan area, they are exempt from Chapter 30B, which are rules for public procurement, so they can negotiate directly with potential development partners. However, if redevelopment authorities themselves are developers, they are subject to Chapter 149, which requires separate sub-bids, which significantly increases the cost of development. So they're both independently acting, but they're also bound by public rules. So what did we find? General takeaways. Our first finding is that redevelopment authorities' effectiveness, given all these powers, is determined by staffing, funding, and sustained local support, not the institutional setup. So it doesn't really matter. We're arguing whether we have a standalone entity like in Cambridge, or the redevelopment authority has been folded into city government as in Taunton. Our second main finding is that redevelopment authority's effectiveness is limited due to a lack of dedicated funding, technical assistance, clear guidance, particularly legal guidance, and advocacy. There is no collective voice for redevelopment authorities. And all this despite a rich ecosystem of actors, which we've already heard about in Massachusetts. This slide shows just a fraction of the logos of the many public, quasi-public, and nonprofit organizations that redevelopment authorities do or could interact with. There's not a single one that is focused specifically on redevelopment authorities' needs. This is a wasted opportunity. Because, as we've already heard, in Massachusetts today, housing affordability is an economic development issue, coming back to those two mandates of those two authorities. And it's a regional issue. So why don't we approach it that way? Showing here again, thank you, Boston Globe, for some of your coverage. On the left, the city of Chelsea is trying to figure out how to fill its municipal budget gap, including how to pay for schools, and proposes more market rate residential development to fill that gap at the expense of inclusionary housing and affordable housing. So how is it? How is that Chelsea has to make that calculation? At the same time, Wellesley rejects housing development on state-owned land because it fears an increased strain on its school budget, among many other things. So what if we started to frame housing affordability as central to economic development at a regional scale, with redevelopment authorities playing a key role? And I'll now hand off to Becca to walk us through some thoughts as to how this might happen. Thanks.
Great. Thanks, Suzanne. Is the volume okay? Great. So I'll talk through a few case studies, implications for social housing development, and then I'll review some of our key recommendations. So to start, a redevelopment authority's role is to facilitate development that either the private sector or a conventional city department can't or won't do. And they support housing development already in a few different ways. We split it out across 4 functions. And while these functions overlap considerably in practice, these are how we categorize them. So they engage in land assembly and disposition, planning, financing, and development. And I'll walk through a few case studies for each to show how they're using these powers for housing currently. So to start, redevelopment authorities have many powers related to land that can make development more feasible. So they assemble parcels, they execute land swaps, They hold property across long development cycles, and they sell or transfer land to private, nonprofit, or public partners. And some actually act as long-term stewards, retaining public ownership, or they enable other entities to do so. They can also handle complex real estate deals and environmental cleanup, and they can bring agencies together, like conducting land swaps with the MBTA. And so first, I'll give 2 examples from Holyoke. The first on the far left is the South Holyoke Homes, which is an affordable rental and homeownership project. For this project, the HRA acted as a land assembler and pass-through entity. They transferred vacant city-owned land to the Housing Authority, who led the development. Second, in the middle, is the Far Alpaca Mill redevelopment. Through this project, they acquired a vacant mill site. They chose a developer through an RFP, and then they kept ownership of the land through a ground lease. So that gives them long-term oversight. Third, on the left, is in Attleboro. In their transit-oriented development district. They compiled multiple parcels, they did some environmental remediation, and they conducted a land swap with the MBTA. And that will enable over 600 units of mixed income housing right next to their commuter rail station, as you can see the parking lot right there on the right. So to contrast that a bit with Holyoke, this project leans more heavily on a private development partner, and like most redevelopment authorities, the goal is to spur private development and then exit the project without any long-term ownership or development agreements. And so kind of a key takeaway here is that long-term land stewardship, particularly through ground leases, can maintain affordability over time. Next is planning. Redevelopment authorities often take on planning functions and convene or lead community outreach. And so in Fall River is a key example. The Redevelopment Authority, which is standalone, worked with the city to lead a master planning effort on 20 acres of waterfront property. And they put together a working group, a stakeholder committee, and then also held a public workshop to present the plan and get feedback. And then in Lawrence, when they put together their 2017 urban renewal plan, they led a public process and also partnered with the Lawrence History Center to do a symposium on the history of urban renewal in the city. So their goal was really to create a collectively owned vision of development and hopefully make development more nimble in the future to avoid both conflict over what the vision could be, as well as repeating the past harms of urban renewal. And so a key takeaway here is that planning in close coordination with local stakeholders can help build legitimacy for a project and also accelerate development. Third is financing. So this shapes what housing outcomes redevelopment authorities can achieve, and it ranges widely across actors. So at the simplest level, some are pass-throughs for administering local housing funds or federal or state grants to developers. Others own revenue-generating assets like parking garages, which help pay for their operations and staff. And then a small number of well-resourced redevelopment authorities use their balance sheets to become direct lenders or equity investors in housing. And a key example here is Cambridge. So the CRA has 15 staff and a steady revenue stream from redevelopment in the Kendall Square urban renewal area. They have retained the development rights since the late 70s for 3 key blocks instead of selling the land outright. And that has allowed them to benefit from rising land values over time. So they made a deal with the master developer. Then it was Boston Properties, now it's BXP, where the developer pays for rights as projects get built. So for example, if BXP wants to build a taller residential building where there used to be a parking garage, they have to pay the Cambridge Redevelopment Authority for those rights to build. And so the CRA benefits from that development, and then that goes into their endowment, which is currently around 48 million, which they're using to invest in affordable homeownership projects across the city. To give an even more concrete example, on the left is their Margaret Fuller Neighborhood House project. They're partnering with this Cambridge nonprofit. The CRA is helping restore the historic building. It's the yellow building in the foreground. And then as part of the deal, the CRA will acquire this parking lot and build mixed income housing there. And you can see also a residential tower in the background recently built by BXP, and the sale of the development rights for that tower helped pay for the development that will come on the parking lot. So again, long-term land stewardship can both build revenue and maintain affordability over time. And we see this as a key strategy that redevelopment authorities could bring. Finally, development. This is a bit more rare. Most of the time they are enabling private or nonprofit actors to build, but a subset do take on development directly. So On the left is a development by Rural Development, Inc., which is a nonprofit affiliate of the Franklin County Regional Housing and Redevelopment Authority. This is a really unique regional model, both at the county level and also the only combined housing and redevelopment authority in the state. And while they haven't used their redevelopment authority powers specifically for housing development, we see this as a really interesting opportunity for collaboration. And then on the right is the Malden Redevelopment Authority. They ran a receivership program from 2016 to 2020 where they targeted neglected properties, made repairs, and sold them. So this program was successful. They targeted about 50 homes, but at the same time, it was resource intensive and a parcel by parcel strategy, so difficult for them to scale. So overall, as you can see, they're using these 4 functions to advance housing in their communities, and we see a potential with a few key reforms to support social housing development specifically. So now I'll walk through the recommendations, and those with an asterisk are kind of high priority. So to start, for state policymakers, the current justification for their action is a negative one. It's based on fighting blight, and we recommend amending the enabling legislation to shift that toward 3 positive goals: climate resilience, affordability, and equity. And this aligns with a proposed bill from the city of Boston on the left, or maybe it's your right. Second, they need to be enabled to work at citywide or regional scales. They're currently boxed into urban renewal plan areas, but we see an opportunity for them to take a strategic regional or citywide approach where they could have a citywide social housing plan that kind of implies some sort of affordability requirement or other standards. And third, they should be exempt from filed sub-bid requirements. This rule increases public project costs by 20 to 30%, and that is not including prevailing wage and Davis-Bacon requirements. Also briefly mention, as Susanne said, the state needs to allocate funding for them to engage in pre-development and development work for social housing. And we heard very frequently in interviews that technical assistance and training is needed for board members and staff. We also recommend issuing clear regulatory guidance and exploring potential impacts of expanding redevelopment authority capabilities. Next, for other statewide and regional actors, redevelopment authorities need some kind of community of practice. There's no current group where all of them can come together and discuss their challenges and goals. And one key goal of that group would be to explore opportunities for regional efforts, as the Cape Cod Commission recommended in its 2024 regional housing strategy. It could also address some other open questions around how they could maintain a long-term stake in housing and how they can work alongside housing authorities and land trusts and better access public land held by state agencies. At the municipal level, redevelopment authorities are local tools, so we offer a framework to help communities decide how they might support long-term affordability and public stewardship. And Lynn actually was most recently the city to form a redevelopment authority with the goal of compelling private owners to cooperate with the city's development efforts. And finally, I'll give some recommendations for highly resourced redevelopment authorities with Cambridge as a case study. So we see the CRA and redevelopment authorities that are similar as well-positioned to take on social housing, and we have 3 major recommendations. So the first is to use your financial capacity to complement and strengthen existing efforts and organizations. The second is to use your planning capacity to visualize what the upzoning in Cambridge makes possible. This could be how phasing could work, how to achieve quality design, and to put capital behind that vision. And the third is to focus on large, complex sites where private actors have failed to deliver, Alewife being one of those. Overall, our hope is that this paper starts a statewide conversation about the possibilities for developing mixed-income housing that maximizes affordability over time through a public ownership stake. And by recentering attention on redevelopment authorities, we hope to find ways to retool them as productive, accountable actors for the future. I'll now pass it off to our panel. Thank you.
Thank you, Becca and Suzanne.
we started out this project, and I don't know that we understood exactly how big it would end up being. And I think part of it was their enthusiasm for the effort that led them to investigate so many redevelopment authorities across the state. And as Becca's last comment said, we hope this report will begin to stimulate a conversation about how redevelopment authorities and the public sector broadly can play a role in meeting our need for housing. And so this is the beginning of that conversation. So let me just point out the panelists we have with us. David, do you want to put up the slide with the panelists' names on it? So we have Tom Evans, who's the executive director of the Cambridge Redevelopment Authority, who's also one of the motivating forces behind the study. Thank you, Tom. We have Marcos Marrero, the deputy director and senior vice president at Mass Development, representing a broad point of view from the state. We have Emily Key Innes, president of Innes Land Strategies Group, who provides a perspective from working with a broad range of redevelopment authorities. We have Jonathan Gray, vice chair of the Taunton Redevelopment Authority, and his day job is also working with a regional planning agency in the South Shore. And then we have, last but not least, Gina Giovanni, the executive director of the Franklin County Regional Housing and Redevelopment Authority, as we heard, one of the unique kind of configurations in the state. So we've got big cities, well-resourced, smaller places, rural places, the state perspective. So I think we have the makings for a really good conversation. So let me start off, and I almost hesitated to ask this question about what is social housing, because I will say that as we started this study, we'd call people up and say, we want to talk to you about the possibility of redevelopment authorities getting involved in social housing, and half the conversation would be, what the heck is social housing? But I think it's important, if that's what we're talking about, to start off with that. As we heard from Susanne and Becca, we defined it for this project as developments with a significant role for the public sector in planning, financing, or owning housing that's produced to maintain as permanently affordable and serving a broad range of incomes. But it has a lot of different aspects to it, and kind of where you sit may determine what you think of it. So let me start, Tom, with you. We just heard from your mayor. The city of Cambridge is investigating the possibility of social housing. So from where you sit in Cambridge as the redevelopment authority, how do you think of social housing?
Sorry, I forgot I didn't have a lapel microphone. Thanks, Chris. And also, I just want to thank for launching our community of practice effort that you mentioned right now. This is, I guess, the official beginning of that. So you're asking me to redefine the elephant in the room that you mentioned before. And I see it really as the intersection of two things. One is public backing of housing projects, and two, mixed income. And the value of the public backing comes in a few layers. One is just making sure projects are feasible, especially in times like this, making sure that they're sustainable and they're operating over long term. And then also that there's control over the governance of that housing over the long term. On the mixed income, I mean, I think a lot of the value of that is very clear, but one, you're getting affordable housing built. And I think the other key thing that the report mentions is the economic opportunity that having mixed communities provides all levels of economic development. You know, that particularly matters when you have a large project that might be sitting in isolation. One of the things we've talked about in Cambridge is we have a mixed income environment throughout our city. And so a smaller scale development is landing in a mixed income environment automatically. But with bigger projects, that becomes more necessary.
Great. And so, Gina, I want to turn to you. So Tom's sitting in Cambridge. You're out Western Massachusetts in Franklin County. And as I said, you know, you're unusual in that your organization is not just a redevelopment authority, it's a housing authority, public housing authority. You also, we heard, have a nonprofit subsidiary that does light tech development. So where does this concept of social housing fit in the range of housing you're providing?
So thank you. It is a very different market. Franklin County is a very weak market in Massachusetts, and our main issue right now is population loss and an aging population. So, you know, we're not exactly struggling in the same way you are here with high rents, but we are still struggling with extremely high housing cost burden because we have such low incomes. One of the things that we have that I can't not speak to enough is a need for more middle income housing to attract more people to come here. I mentioned this just anecdotally. The president of our community college is in her fourth home since she's taken the role in 2 years because she could not find housing. We have the lowest vacancy rates in the state, and that might seem ostentatious sitting here in Cambridge, but we do in Franklin County for home ownership and for rental. There is no housing. So when we're trying to recruit and attract middle income professionals to come and be our presidents of our community college, doctors, other professional positions, we don't have the housing. So I see social housing as a way for us to hopefully expand our population and stabilize our economy.
And I would say that our definition of social housing as we presented here today was fairly narrow. Some of the reports that Susanne put up on the screen, there's a broad range of other issues that people bring into play in social housing. One big thing that we haven't talked about is resident engagement in that process. But there's an important reason for the word social. So John, I want to bring you into the conversation as a planner. How do you think about social housing? And is there an aspect of that social piece that we ought to be taking into account as well?
Sure. Well, yeah, I'm a transportation planner at a regional planning agency in Southeastern Mass, and also serve as a vice chair of the Taunton Redevelopment Authority. My comments today are personal, not representing those specific organizations. But, from the, perspective of, I agree with the report in terms of, a long-term sort of public ownership stake to kind of, be the police of the development over the long term and preserving that affordability. I think that makes sense. I think for housing development, there's a lot of other things that you kind of want to think about. And one of them might be, design or site design. And how do you lay out the design in a way that facilitates neighborly interactions between people? Because I think when I hear social housing, I think, how do you facilitate getting a better understanding of who your neighbors are and developing friendships and childcare arrangements, as a young parent, different kind of situations I think can be better fostered when you have, in some cases, more dense housing, more transit-oriented developments. And really, I think at the end of the day, just trying to kind of figure out a way to make it not just a housing unit, but homes for folks.
And I think that's an important element of the public leading role here in the development process, is to take a broader view of value for the public. And so the things you're talking about, childcare centers and other ways in which this housing is contributing to building community, is a really important piece. I just want to call out Susanne Schindler, who's written some interesting pieces for us about social housing and the role of design in social housing. So this is a shameless plug for the Joint Center's website for you to check out. But Emily, let me bring you into the conversation. So have we left anything out from your point of view about social housing as you think about it?
You haven't left anything out. I just want to build on what a few of my colleagues up here have said. I think it's about the social connections, certainly within the housing to be built, that idea of bringing people together, different backgrounds, what they can add together. But I think you also need to connect it to the rest of the community. So how do you build new housing that is bringing together residents who have been there for a while, residents who are new to the area, and how do they establish a web of physical and social connections that kind of strengthen the community as a whole? And I think that's one thing, not to preempt this, but I think that's one thing that redevelopment agencies as redevelopment authorities as a quasi-public authority can have, that higher view of how do you connect these disparate pieces into that greater whole that we look for as planners.
Great. And Mark, is there anything you want to add to that part of the conversation?
Yeah, I would say one of the interesting parts of considering how we build actionable, programming and transactions around social housing is that it's almost as malleable as the definition of blight, right? Like you think of what are social goals in a particular place. I was with a friend of mine this weekend. She still has, I guess technically, had a 1-bedroom apartment in Manhattan. Well, they had kids, right? They're going through life, going through the socioeconomic part. And did they move? No, there's no housing. So they just split the 1 bedroom so the kid can have another one. Right. So my point with this is that some of the things isn't just about cost, it's about how many rooms do you have in the units and the availability of those things. Being able to construct 2-room, 3-room, 4-room, right? Like we need to have options because otherwise housing units, they're not homogeneous, right? And for the economists in the room or economist friendly, you can have non-homogeneous goods, but that are substitute goods. So if I don't have a house that I want, I can buy the other one and fix it up. I can dip into the naturally occurring affordable housing pool, which raises the cost for middle income families. And those folks may not be able to go into an income restricted housing unit, right? So either unrestricted or highly loosely price controlled, income controlled units will be important to not exclude folks.
So, and you bring up an important dimension of this, which is that I think one of the motivations for social housing and why we're bringing in this new term is that the nature of housing affordability problems have broadened. And so it's not just, not that it ever was, but it's like 25 years ago, the issue really was about very low income folks not having access to housing they can afford. And now it's middle income folks not having rental they can afford. It's folks who can't get on the first rung for home ownership. So and we've touched upon this. I don't want to go into it too deep. We don't have to. But as you look at this, what the notion for public action is the private sector is not able or to provide housing at these different points of the spectrum. Which in your different communities are you seeing that need for public intervention? So maybe I'll start with you again, just to and so Cambridge, like where would you see the Cambridge Redevelopment Authority kind of filling a need that's not being met?
Well, I think that in addition to the high cost of construction, which is clearly a statewide issue, we have extremely high land cost. And that creates I guess, a responsibility to your investors if you're a private developer to maximize what you can out of that piece of land because you've paid so much for it. So one of the things we have been thinking a lot about is how to write down that expectation of what the land's value is, and also provide patient capital sources that can look at the long view rather than the short-term profitable gain that a developer may want. And whether that's us acting as a builder or writing that into a development agreement for another developer is just reconsidering what exactly the recoup should be over that land investment and also the high cost of construction.
And Emily, so as you work with a bunch of communities, and you look across these communities, do you see different needs, different parts of the housing spectrum where there's needed for public action?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of different ways that we think about it depending on the community. So there is the young person or group that can't get on the property ladder. There are the older people who are in places that are too large or configured incorrectly. I think Massachusetts average housing age is kind of in the 1940s or so. We live very differently than we did then. When we start getting into issues of how does the private market not be able to act, a neighborhood full of lead paint and asbestos is too great for one entity coming in alone. So we have the housing condition as well as the suitability of the housing. Affordability, when I'm working in Western Mass or Central Mass, I talk about Boston construction and labor prices, but non-Boston rent and housing prices. So there's that affordability level there. So I think that it starts to get very complex as you go from, it's like all the problems are the same, but the solutions are very individual to each community, or in some cases, the community and a little bit beyond. Who are they next to? What are their pricing factors? So that becomes a challenge in trying to plan for each community, is getting a real sense of what works for them and how we meet those challenges.
Great. And I want to make sure we kind of facilitate a conversation. So if anybody in the panel has a reaction to things, just raise your hand and jump in as well. One of the things we haven't touched on is the role of forms of home ownership as part of social housing. Before we move on to talking about the powers of redevelopment authorities, do folks have, as I mentioned in my framing of this, it's not just about low income or moderate income households, it's also people trying to get into home ownership and try to create that rung on the ladder, but also retaining some sort of degree of ownership. Do folks have any experience in creating? Gina, do you have home ownership models?
So one of the examples that we shared a picture of is Wisdom Way Solar Village, which is a wonderful development with a community garden. You would love it. We were talking about that earlier. But near net zero net energy units that were developed by my nonprofit affiliate in 2012. Incomes range from 80 to 100 to market rate. There is not enough equity in this development 14 years later to continue to support it. There's just, in terms of condo fees and continuing to support the lowest income residents there. And this is something that we see through our affiliates at CHAPA across the state when you're talking about setting equitable condo fees. And when we talk about social housing, we can't not talk about this. People who are at moderate and middle incomes, how are they going to equitably buy into the common features of a social housing? So I think that's a key place where I'd love to see a richer community of practice. And as Emily said, everything is going to be slightly individual, but there's a lot more that we need to dive into if we're going down this road.
Tom?
I mean, I think it's key that the definition of social housing includes home ownership, and it comes with the higher level of control that is a discussion point of social housing, that you have governance and ability to control your own destiny, but it also comes with responsibility. And we want to make sure we're not setting people up to take on a responsibility that they're not able, or their household's not able to maintain. And I think that that's a challenge we talk about a lot, as far as, well, what do you really want to have a home ownership building that has an elevator in it, which then is another level of maintenance and operations responsibility versus single family homes or townhouses where you really just have to take care of your box and your section. And I think thinking about the community practice, thinking about also how we train future homeowners to make sure they understand that responsibility. Condo associations, how are they trained to set aside the right kind of funds for those capital improvements? And even as a homeowner yourself, you don't get an instruction book of how to be a homeowner. Even when you buy a single family home, there's a lot of things that you don't know, and you don't know what you don't know when you're getting into home ownership.
Which is kind of like childbirth. It's a good thing we don't know, otherwise we'd never go there.
I was going to say that first major thing that breaks down, the very first, that's a big shock, right? You're absolutely right. We don't train people for the unexpected.
Yeah, and I think the notion of social housing is that there is a stewardship aspect to this. And so across the spectrum of tenures, if you're talking about a home ownership spectrum, the idea is that there's still social and you're not alone. Yeah, John?
The other thing I would add, just hearing the conversation, I think one of the things that comes to mind is sort of the intergenerational housing. So, really not just thinking about, older adult housing and then, college housing, but thinking about ways that there can be synergy between both. I mean, obviously, I think some older adults would benefit from having a neighbor that's able to maybe help them bring groceries up the stairs or something like that. The second thing I'll add is, just because I'm a transportation planner, I have to, I'm sorry, just say that the housing affordability is obviously the core challenge here. And we talk about the 30% of your income and in relation to how much you can spend. But I would just say transportation costs are also something we should consider in all of this conversation, because, for Cambridge, it's a pretty transit rich community. And so your overall housing and transportation budget, yeah, you're paying more in rent or in your mortgage payment. But if you can maybe spend a little bit less, then all of a sudden it's more affordable. For a community like Taunton, we hadn't had commuter rail service since 1958. And we just got it back in last year in 2025. And even the commuter rail station that is in Taunton, the closest residential dwelling that can actually walk to that station is like a 20+ minute walk away. And so, I think we want the public investments, whether it's housing or transportation, to kind of facilitate an affordable lifestyle. And I think thinking about ways that developments and where they're placed and what kind of amenities are there, how much parking they provide or how much parking they don't provide. Those are all important considerations too in terms of the overall affordability picture.
All right. So I want to now turn into the nuts and bolts of the conversation, which is that we're talking about the powers and capacities of redevelopment authorities to address these housing challenges. So what would you all say are the advantages that RAs bring to addressing these challenges? And are there situations where these powers and capacity may be more or less useful? Marcus, you have a perspective from the state. What's your take on this question?
Well, funny enough, most of my perspective comes as a local official. My prior job in Holyoke, you saw two of my projects up there. A couple of things. I would say when, tax title foreclosure is a big way in which some cities take land, and we're talking about cost of land, right? So that's a whole level of complex. It just got more complex over the last year. Usually, so someone doesn't pay their tax bill long enough, you take them to land court, you foreclose on the piece of property, and you take it and I say, okay, congratulations. Now you have essentially a free piece of land because someone's being a freeloader. Now someone has to figure it out. The city will then, to the advantage of the RA question, RA, go figure it out. Here you go. In weaker performing markets, you can have a cluster of these. You can start making something together, or you can do several projects if they're not closely together. Most recently, the Supreme Court has dictated that that the way that local jurisdictions are doing tax title foreclosure is I'm not a lawyer, so one of the lawyers in the room can correct the language, but basically unconstitutional. It presents an undue taking. A property could be on paper worth 100 units of currency, and they owe you 10 units of currency, and therefore you're unduly taking 90 units of currency, right? So now there's this whole process which you have to decide whether you're going to pay them for the difference or you're going to just recoup your 10 units at, whatever. You have to decide very quickly based on new legislation to meet the constitutional barrier. Now, that has essentially increased the land cost, right? So the advantage here is that the RA can work very closely with the city, and it's possible that cities themselves don't have the mechanism because they have to set up all these things very quickly and make real estate decisions very quickly. They can work very closely with a city, and if they're capitalized well enough, they can do the foreclosure. Historically, they have been a good way for the city to aggregate and land bank these places to do the development. Because they're locally controlled, they're a trusted source as well. So we are a local control state, right? We know that by zoning, but also it's comforting to say, well, I can give it to the redevelopment authority because it's not some strange entity, right? Like my neighbor Bob's on the board, all right? Or people know folks on the redevelopment authority, and so they're vested with trust, which is not in legislation, but is part of community building.
And how common is tax foreclosure across the state? Does it happen in some communities?
It's more common in less affluent communities for sure.
Right.
Yes.
And do you see that, Gina, in Franklin?
Absolutely. And I think, one of the advantages that we have as a regional player is that we can offer our services to towns where we might only interact with them in one instance, and this might be the one instance, but from time to time, you're not going to always need a redevelopment authority in a town of 500 or 1,600 people. So having a regional model really works.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think there's a lot of folks that, when they think of redevelopment authorities, they might think of the old mill, kind of situation with, certainly gateway cities are no stranger to, old mills that, maybe the first floor is used, but the second, third, fourth is, a lot of vacancy. So I think that certainly is, something that, is an opportunity for redevelopment authorities to really make sure that, a lot of these historic structures that we have across the state are best utilized so that we're not just building new, but really fixing up, the structures that we've already built in the past.
Emily?
Yes, and the other thing about redevelopment authorities I think is really important is that they're the only entity at the local level that's really set up to do land development. If you've got a city council or a select board, they're really about the day-to-day of what's going on, the setting the policies, the working with the city manager or the town manager. If you've got town meeting that's only acting maybe once or twice a year, they are most definitely not set up to make land use decisions that require multiple, they can make the, yes, we'd like to dispose of this property decision, but they can't do things on a regular basis. But a redevelopment authority where the people on it can be appointed and have the range of experience, the people who are staffing it have development experience, that is an entity that can actually work with land on a time scale that would work for a development.
I think it's interesting that you mentioned the word trust. We've at the CRA had to spend 14 years rebuilding trust with the community, and I think not all redevelopment authorities have that or as a practice throughout the country. So that key local control and is really important to build that trust. I think the other element that I see redevelopment authorities being at is the intersection between public interest and private development and straddling that. It's a very awkward place. But if you can leverage private development experience and know-how to get public outcomes using various tools, development agreements, financing agreements, and so forth, you can use the private sector to help get what you want in a social housing environment. And I think particularly targeting the income levels, household income levels that are not necessarily the target of the housing authorities or LIHTC projects that the nonprofit, we have a very strong nonprofit housing development sector here in the Boston area and in Somerville and Cambridge. However, their mandate is not necessarily the missing middle that we're talking a lot about.
So you mentioned that trust has come up, and I think that's, in some respects, that's another elephant in the room when you're talking about redevelopment authorities. And so maybe I'd just be curious how other folks, maybe Jonathan in Taunton, I mean, is this an issue that you've had to do? Tom talked about taking 14 years to rebuild trust. Has this come up in your community too?
Definitely. Yeah. Back in the, I think 70s or 80s, one of our authority staff was it was a bribe situation. There was like federal charges. And so, absolutely, I think that is one of the things that you can't change what has happened in the past, but you can change what happens in the future. And so I think that's part of the reason why I think one of the things in the urban renewal process is the public engagement. And I think that a redevelopment authority can really have a really strong public engagement process to sort of facilitate what the ultimate community goal is. I want to say in the report, Lawrence, they're sort of reckoning with the past actions of the redevelopment authority in decades past and sort of coming with historical researchers, but coming together and saying, okay, what do we want to do moving forward? And I think that's how you can build trust is listening to the community and then them seeing that you're actually moving forward with what the recommendations that they gave you are. And so you can really only build trust in that way. And so yeah, go ahead.
I just wanted to add, so I was the project manager on the consultant team for the Lawrence Urban Renewal Plan, and I was in the room when the Lawrence History Center sponsored that. I have to say it was one of the most powerful moments in my career as a planner because I was sitting in the audience along with members of the Lawrence Redevelopment Authority. The Lawrence History Center had brought together people who had fought the urban renewal in Lawrence in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, who were still around. And they had a panel of people and everybody was sitting in the audience. And one of the members on the panel said, it's such a difference now, this opening event to the new urban renewal process, because they said when we were in the room and protesting it, the Lawrence Redevelopment Authority wouldn't look us in the eye. They sat there at their table and wrote things on on their papers, and they wouldn't look us in the eye. And now the Lawrence Redevelopment Authority is in the audience listening to us. And so I think your point about rebuilding trust is critical in urban renewal, because every time we go into a community, they're saying, is this the 1950s? When do you take first meeting? When are you taking my house? So we have to recognize that if we're talking, as you said, talking about urban renewal, talking about redevelopment authorities, that there is an overwhelming negative impression. And how do you start off that discussion by acknowledging that and moving forward?
So I want to jump in here and talk about trust and just acknowledge the hat I wear as a public housing authority. Primarily, that is what I'm known as. Although I do have an independent nonprofit affiliate, I kind of wear those two hats. And redevelopment authority is kind of, it's part of my powers, and I've never really used it. So that's where I'm sitting. But I think that when we're talking about social housing, to exclude the public housing community from this conversation would be a real misstep. I think building the trust among public housing to ensure that we're bringing public housing and those income levels into the social housing equation is a really, it's I think ultimately what we all want. And what I don't want to see is housing resources that are gathered up between upwards of 60% of AMI, to get technical for a moment, up to 200% of AMI, and then, sort of this like concentration of poverty in public housing where there's just, it's going to be sort of like an all or none. I want to see a merger and a trust built between those of us who are doing what we're here doing today. And that really includes a lot of LIHTC developers as well, who are really doing the same work. And many of them are doing a lot of mixed low and market rate housing. This is a great additional tool, but a lot of this work is happening already. So I just want to acknowledge that and hope that we can start there in our community of practice that's begun here today.
And one point on trust, which is it doesn't require anything nefarious to lose trust, right? Like these things take a long time because by almost definition, these types of projects are working with the worst sites. The easiest sites, the market takes care of it live, right? It's they can extract the value out of it predictably, and the public sector is called to do the things that the marketplace is not doing. And so it's the hardest parcel, it's the most dilapidated building, it's the place that doesn't have the infrastructure. And so it takes a long time, and people want to trust, but they will verify. And so if it's an entity that's not around, it's not providing updates, what's happening, at best these things take 1 to 2 years to start. At worst, like some of these projects, it's taken a decade, right? So you have to, it's not only the engagement on the visioning, it's like what's happening, what are we waiting for next, that kind of thing.
Yeah, I want to go. Did you want to jump in?
Yeah, I was just gonna add, in terms of one of the report's recommendations is sort of reframing redevelopment authority's mandate from eliminating blight towards building more sustainable, resilient housing. And I think, to Marcos's point, a lot of the sites that a redevelopment authority might, seek to work with are those like blighted properties that are, underutilized, have been for decades. And so I think just in terms of how you're actually going about this, as a redevelopment authority board member, going into a room with a property owner and saying, your property is blighted and we're going to list it as a potential acquisition. I mean, to change the conversation around that to your property can house a lot of people and we want to help you do that. I think that that's just kind of completely reframing the conversation. And I think for a property owner, that I think matters a lot.
I want to dig into this, but I also don't want to leave the conversation we're just having too, which is about the kind of relative role of different authorities. And so now I think we wrestled a bit in writing this paper because we were focused very much on redevelopment authorities, and we didn't want the paper to be redevelopment authorities versus housing authorities. But as Susanne pointed out, they come from the same part of the statute, and there are roles for both. And I think it depends upon the place you're in, the kind of capacities they bring to it. Gina is both. And so she's under one roof. But, Tom, I put this question to you. So you happen to be in the city blessed with a very strong redevelopment authority and a very strong housing authority, the Cambridge Housing Authority. Folks in the room, Cambridge Housing Authority, woohoo! Just a really high-flying, very effective housing authority. So how do you see your role complementing CHA? They're your partners in this. I would say.
Yeah, I mean, I'd also say we have a very strong housing division that is focused on primarily a lot of the LIHTC work, but also the Affordable Housing Trust. So I think that we actually have a very strong housing infrastructure already. So the question is very real. I don't think anyone wants to like own the playing field here. I think it's something that all hands on deck for addressing our affordable housing crisis at all levels is really key. So, I mean, I think we have a lot to learn from the Housing Division and Housing Authority on housing work. We have had a recent focus on affordable home ownership, and that is, again, we're not trying to own that niche, but that's an area that we actually made a commitment to City Council that we'd work on based on another project. So that for the time being, a lot of our projects have focused on that element that don't necessarily qualify for LIHTC. It's not saying that the affordable housing nonprofit community isn't doing that work and housing authorities haven't done that kind of work. Historically, there's a number of projects that have gone back and forth between the Housing Authority and the Cambridge Redevelopment Authority for different reasons. Every project has its different storyline, but each of the housing projects we've done in the past or in our urban renewal project in Wellington Harrington, there were projects that had some time in either authority.
What is LIHTC?
I'm sorry. So low income tax credits. So it's the process by which the federal government invests in affordable housing.
Thank you.
And thank you for that question. We do in the housing world perhaps more than others. We get caught in our own little jargon, and so I've heard this thing. We have the jargon giraffe. A little hand can go up and say, "What was that?" So the low-income housing tax credit program is the principal source of building new affordable housing in this country, and it's been a powerful program, long-lasting. But it builds housing that's affordable at 60% of AMI. And so one of the reasons why there's been the rise of the social housing movement, Susanne's slide called this out, is that LIHTC is focused very specifically on renters at 60% of AMI. And so there's a broader need.
Chris, what is AMI?
Marcus gets 2 points. I love that. Area median income. And so when we're talking about housing eligibility, typically incomes are defined as a percentage of the area median income. So in Cambridge, the area median income, Chris Cotter, is
120.
120. So it's pretty high, but if you go out to Franklin, it's probably a lot lower. So everything's relative to where you live and to what the income cutoffs are. Before we move on, any other, Gina, I want to come back to you a little bit and dig in because you said you haven't used your redevelopment authority powers much. Are there ways in which you want to dust some of those off for some of these new things?
Well, yeah, there's one community we're working with that we've been talking about this one parcel, and it's a parcel that's far too big for us to look at as a nonprofit developer independently, but it's something where we could potentially be sort of a piece of the transaction. And so we are looking at that. We also are we are the community development block grant administrator for any community, any non-entitlement community in Franklin County. So we're very well versed in how to do this work. The piece that I want to talk to you really briefly that I think is different among different sort of public housing, LIHTC in particular, when you look at compliance, is the stewardship of what we're building here and how we're going to go on treating these residents in years to come. When you look at the lowest income programs, you think about things like the Section 8 voucher program and public housing, the burden of proving income and recertifying and re-upping is heavy. It's very heavy. And when you talk about social housing, you're talking about upper income and you're talking about potentially a lighter touch, something that is either just, upon resale or perhaps an annual recertification. So I think it's an interesting place to talk about, and it's a large part of what has sort of driven the public housing authority industry is how are we working with our residents? How are we governing our policies toward eligibility and compliance? And it's very similar as a LIHTC, for all of those private entities as well. So I don't know if any of the colleagues, I'm sorry to take the moderator role right away from you, but I think it's when you talk about social housing, you talk about maintaining this housing over time. I think it's a good opportunity to talk about that as well.
I know that maybe it was about 10 years ago, the housing division had done a survey really targeting middle income housing and income restricted housing, and that one of the findings was a lot of the people in the income bracket do have other options. They might not be in Cambridge, and so there's a choice that they may have about putting themselves forward into that income verification process, and the possibility they might move out of that income basis or finding somewhere else nearby, at least 10 years ago that might have been achievable. So that is a burden that not everyone wants to take on, especially if they're looking for upward mobility themselves.
There's a whole other stream we could go into here. This issue that you raise about income certification and rent setting, and the conversation about social housing is drawing a lot on European models, where the concept is much looser, in the sense that in Vienna, 75% of the population is eligible for social housing. Your income is checked when you go in, and mind you, it's not a very rigorous check because 75% of the people qualify, and it's not checked again. And the rent isn't set relative to your income. The rent is set at what it costs to provide that housing. And so that creates a simple way these compliance issues, which take up an enormous amount of resources and effort, go away. And the idea that you're creating this kind of sense of like, your income has to be in this box to live in this community, as opposed to broadly, a lot of us live in this community. So there's a whole other conversation about saying, how do we think about this concept of housing that becomes simpler to manage, serves a broader range of people, as part of this concept. But that's another panel, I think. I wanted to get, because we don't have a lot of
That
time.
panel should be in Europe. We should all.
I want to turn to the kind of specifics of what we're recommending. And John, you started to pull us into this, but so we have three different categories of recommendations. One of them is about amending the state legislation in various ways. Another is about creating this community of practice, providing funding, technical assistance, training, advocacy. And the last is, which we didn't talk about as much, is conducting research to address some key questions. But let's start with the main recommendation, which is about this changing the neighborhood legislation to broaden the mandate. You talked about blight, Jonathan. I think the issues we're facing now are not what they were in the 1940s and 50s. And so it's not, as we talk about it, there's climate resilience, there's equity issues. We're trying to address public intervention, not just to address blight, but to address the opposite end of the spectrum, which is gentrification. And so there's a need for public intervention there. So Jonathan, you seem like you're ready to jump in.
Well, as the benefit of working on a regional scale, I've had the opportunity to kind of look at planning documents from a number of different redevelopment authorities in southeastern Mass, and I know of at least one where there's a property listed as a potential acquisition for basically climate resilience. It's like this area is going to be underwater soon. Like talking about sea level rise and the need for sort of like a sponge park, or basically more green infrastructure to kind of adapt, and so it's kind of hard to fit the climate resilience argument into blight. So it's not necessarily the same. Blighted atmosphere, maybe, I guess, but yeah. So I think certainly the recommendation of kind of taking this 1940s approximately definition and giving it a fresh 2026 or something update makes a lot of sense.
Emily?
I'm so going to challenge you on that. So the key was the word sponge park. I know that project. I wrote those words. So one of the things about climate change is you have, and the issue with this and with another community I worked with is repetitive loss from flooding. And so the argument came down is not, are you correcting current conditions of blight, but are you helping the community avoid future conditions of blight? And so if you've got a situation in which the flooding is happening on an increasing basis, and at some point the insurance company says, yeah, now what? No. What do you do with that property then? And so the idea was to set up for both of these communities in slightly different ways. How do you say, okay, the redevelopment authority could have the option of acquiring this property. Once it gets to that stage, what would be the purpose of acquisition? this is a place that's flooding. In both cases, it was envisioned as public land that could be turned into something that the waters could come in, either infiltrate or recede either way, and then it could be reused. So I think this idea of blight could certainly be, the definition of blight could certainly be reevaluated for the 21st century. There are components in there already about economic change, about the condition of the infrastructure. We do look a lot at flooding because that, as I said, I had one community, I've had several communities where I've worked on issues of sea level rise. Well, if you're getting flooding from that, then you're getting corrosiveness from the salt water. And so that's going to make housing even harder once it's flooded to bring back to a certain level. So I think we could take a harder look at that and start to think, well, what is in the 21st century, what is the mandate for public action that the private community can't do? And that could certainly be one of them.
Tom?
I think even if you wanted to stay within the economic development box, and this was brought up in the presentation briefly, that I mean, housing is a threat to, I think, the region, the Boston region, our economic future, right? If you cannot have housing for most of your middle level employees. We talk a lot about arts districts and the importance of performing arts and visual arts in our community, and we're losing that, and that's a part of the economic vitality of the region, and I think the cities really focus in on that. So even within, just if you sort of say, well, you have to stay within your economic development box, I think housing is part of that.
But do you think so? To the extent is do we need to change the language, or can you work within? Well, it sounds like you're saying we can work within the language. I mean, it seems like people have been doing
we spend a lot of time trying to figure out how to work within the language, so I don't want to like overplay that we can't do some of the things we're doing because we have to change the language because we're trying to do them anyway. Certainly there are things that would make doing things easier. One of the things that we've discussed, we've been using the demonstration plan model as a way to say, okay, we're doing something unique and something we will share with the community practice as a way for us to get some of the redevelopment tools. Theoretically, you can only do that once, right? Or maybe twice. And so what other kinds of plans or innovative plans could you tuck under that allowed plan that gives you flexibility beyond an urban renewal plan that could create some access to some of those tools? So there may be tweaks that are important. I don't know if we need a whole cloth rewriting of the law. However, I think it's a great idea to think about how can we have a positively focused mission rather than reactive.
Yeah, and if I can just add to that, blight is one of those things that, again, that first meeting, hey, we're going to do an urban renewal plan, a redevelopment plan, a revitalization plan in your community. So when are you taking my house? And how dare you call my neighborhood blighted? I live here. This is a strong community. We're very house proud. All the different things that come into it. How dare you? And then there's a long explanation from me about, well, the technical definition of blight is bop, 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 and it goes shh. And it's, how dare you call my neighborhood blighted? So I do love the idea of that positive reframing of what is the mission. How do we do that? Is that us in our work reframing it collectively and the legislation stays the same? Is there a tweak to those words that makes it easier? I don't know the right answer, but I do know it's an important discussion.
And here's where I think it matters, right? Because the thing, as bureaucrats, when we go through these hoops, and can we work in it? Yes. When does it matter? When someone wants to stop you, right? So you buy a property, take a property, or it's in a plan, it's before the city council, and someone says that that doesn't meet blight. Can someone sue you? So sometimes it's time, because you also have to convince your board. And the board is like, well, does it meet and so like literally 3 months can go just by that one conversation. That's 3 meetings in negotiations. So it could provide certainty. Certainty cuts time. Cutting time cuts cost. So being able to say, yes, this is something that publicly we agree on and we can move forward on, that could be quicker and more certain.
Yeah, I would just say, as Emily described, like blight, the definition is exceptionally broad. So I think it's a challenge, but also it is an opportunity, as they've said. So, I think maybe it's, blight and housing, or, so kind of almost adding on, but, you at the end of the day, it's really kind of up to a subjective, kind of opinion.
I want to I'm sure a lot of folks have read Abundance, and just the general takeaway of the book is, we're trying to serve 8 gods here and we have no housing. And so if we want to focus on this, I think one of the critical things, and this impacts housing authorities as well as redevelopment authorities, is the filed sub-bid rule. And that is truly, with prevailing wage, a 40% tax, not just in terms of cost, but time it takes to develop housing. So if you wonder why things aren't happening, we're trying to serve labor goals, we're trying to serve environmental goals, and housing is suffering.
Gina, this is like the jargon, Jeff. Break that down for us. What exactly does that rule require folks to do?
So basically what that means is that we put something out to bid, and if the project is of a certain cost, let's say it's $1 million plus project, that contractor that submits a bid to us has to accept the sub bids if there are subcontractors, electricians, plumbers on that job. So they might say in their bid, oh, we're going to give you $1.5 million, and we're going to say that plumbing costs $70,000, but then the plumber comes in and says, oh, that's going to be 95. And they have to accept that plumber's bid. So that just drove the cost up. And that is a modest little estimate I just gave you.
So basically every component, so if I'm a private sector firm, I go out and get a GC, he gives me one all-encompassing bid. But now you got to say, oh, get a bid from the plumber, get a bid from the electrician, get a bid for the drywaller. And so when they all do that, they all their costs go up. So the overall cost goes up 40%.
I just add it. There also is construction is complicated, and talk about trust. So suddenly having forced marriages of contractors that have maybe not worked together can be a challenge, right? And the trades often have to figure out where their work stops and where another one picks up. And so again, if you have organizations, companies that haven't worked together as much, there's friction in that, and that friction also has costs.
And this issue comes up mostly in terms of redevelopment authorities acting more as developers themselves and putting it out, as opposed to letting the land out and somebody else will then develop it. So if we want to have this more direct public role in the development process, we have to think about how to solve that problem.
Well, I also think that we spend some time in this gray zone of trying to understand where it's a public project and where it's a private project. And some of the stuff we've talked about is like, well, there might be some long-term governance of the redevelopment authority. Well, how much control does that then become a public project? And I don't think it's very well defined. So having some of those rules defined would be helpful.
All right, and we're getting close to the time I want to open it up to you all to ask questions, but I do want to talk about this community of practice that we built. So we have some recommendations there that have to do with more pre-development funding for acquisitions, technical assistance, training. What's really needed to develop this community of practice, and how important, how impactful would these things be? And Marcos, you kind of provide that role at Mass Development in many respects already.
Yeah, I mean, we provide some of that, but more money is always better. And, right. Yes, more money. Yeah, in all seriousness, this is what I would say. Like, let's think about the era in which we built the highway system. And yes, there was a lot of public money going into it, but there was one thing that I think we can take a lesson from is like tolling. Right? If I know I have an income stream from this thing, I can bond against it. And suddenly I can have an influx of capital. And so what I think we have and there are many challenges, this is not the panacea, but in terms of funding specifically, as you recognize, a lot of RAs have a limit on, well, we just don't have any money to even start. And because of many reasons, lack of capacity, like, we're not actual developers in the RA, not me, Mass Development, but like if you're sitting in a redevelopment authority, it's like, well, I don't have a portfolio of 10 buildings I've developed, right? The private sector does. And we have other constraints in the law. So it's easier to identify a private developer. It may be more expedient and cheaper, and you do that, but then you lose your ability to toll the thing because you don't have control of rents. right? So some redevelopment authorities, I believe the Boston Redevelopment Authority did this, and then the Holyoke Redevelopment Authority copied it, is, well, at the time of sale, you get perpetually a 2% or 4% take on that sale. And the Supreme Judicial Court of Massachusetts said it was legal. And so that's cool, but then it has to sell, right? But like, how can you toll continuously? And we have experience doing district increment financing, but that's like you draw a circle around an area and you say any of the incremental taxes of that area goes to this bucket to pay for, I don't know, the sewer line, right? But we could make it a virtual run, right? Like, can the redevelopment authority take a cut off of the eventual taxes of this thing that wouldn't have existed without the redevelopment authority? And that is like a melding of mechanisms that we have. And then you don't have to be the developer. You don't have to make the widget you have to create. You don't have to force it onto the least productive entity in society to make it because it's not a developer. But then you can have a revolving line of money that then you can monetize, right? I think that's critical. Like, yes, we can stand here and be like, yeah, the state should just give more money. I mean, that's, or like, that's a recommendation for everything. And we're very gracious when that happens. But, you know, finding ways of capturing value, I think would be critical.
Well, and Tom, I mean, that's kind of what Cambridge has done, right? To be able to capture some value to create your balance sheet, or am I wrong? You're looking up like.
Well, we don't have like formal value capture the way like tax increment financing is described. Having worked in California where tax increment financing is used extensively, it is a power I wish we could use a little bit more. And in California, before redevelopment was dissolved, there was a requirement that a certain amount of tax increment had to go towards housing. So there were rules with that power. Yeah, we've used that. We're basically leveraging the, as described in the presentation, the value of Kendall Square to reinvest funds elsewhere in the community for what we often call social purpose real estate projects related to nonprofit offices or art spaces that the private sector would not build. And we are now looking to do that more aggressively on housing. One could even argue that it's a mitigation for the success of Kendall Square. We've created a bit of the problem because we've created this economic engine there, and now we need to work on housing the population that would work there.
I got to chime in because we've talked now about highways and mitigation. So got to get back to the bicycle and pedestrian planning here, because the trail-oriented development is the sort of thing that, you know, we all know that, you know, if it's a 5-lane highway with a little bike lane next to it, no one's going to ride on it. But if you have a shared use path along the river, all of a sudden everyone wants to ride on it, right? And that is an economic development tool, as MassDOT has described at length in the shared use path impact study, about building communities. And I believe the Joint Centers had a rail trail kind of showing the value of, you know, communities that have a rail trail versus that don't, and it's like, you know, 7% per decade in terms of, you know, going up in value. And obviously that necessitates affordable housing to sort of, you know, counteract the gentrification sort of effect of that. So you know, that what Marcus said regarding highways, I think that I wish we had that kind of thought process when it comes to sort of developing a bicycle network or just a bicycle and pedestrian network, because right now we have a great transportation system, but it's disconnected. And I think with the mitigation that a lot of these developments, like we talked about Fall River redevelopment, you know, they completely have like, you know, 30 acres of waterfront property now. And it's really a matter of how can you stitch that into the community in a way that makes it so it's affordable and it's actually enjoyable to be there as well.
And if I could just jump on, you know, we've been talking about the financial, if I can talk about the training a little bit, there's a series of organizations in Massachusetts that run what's called the Citizen Planner Training Collaborative. And it is annually in March, and sometimes, you know, statewide, and then sometimes they have a fall one as well in either central or western Massachusetts. And what it is training courses for members of planning boards. And so they bring together nonprofits, consulting planners, people to talk about. They've got a series of what they call modules that are very specific courses that planning board members can take a number of them and get a certificate that they've achieved them. And then they've got, topic-based, what's going on now. Something like that for redevelopment authority members, or even encouraging CPTC to open it up to redevelopment authority members, maybe in the short term, and add some classes. That would be amazing. A couple of my clients over the past year or two, because of things going on in the urban renewal world, have been talking to each other and been reporting the conversations separately back to me, which I enjoy. But I do think some sort of formal training for people who find themselves on the board could be really helpful, to have this standardized, this is how you do X, and then the ability to talk with each other over lunch and compare stories and meet. So I love the idea of having some sort of formalized training.
Yeah, I think that was one of the observations that we had in doing this report. We were talking to these redevelopment authority staff. Oftentimes it was board members because there weren't really any full-time staff. Jonathan, I don't know if that's the situation.
I believe I was quoted. Yeah.
And people felt very alone, and like they felt like we're off here, we're trying to figure this out. Thank God for consultants like Emily and the like to be able to help. But this notion of being able to expand your capacity and understanding through a community of practice, through training, through peer groups and the like. Right. Obviously, the financing is a key part of this, but
yeah, I would say training is essential. I mean, as a planner on the redevelopment authority, I feel like I maybe have a better understanding than a lot of the other folks, maybe in regards to like planning. But there's absolutely a huge need for that sort of training, and I think a sort of a statewide kind of group to kind of bring these ideas together and see if maybe state law changes an opportunity for more regional scale projects, because I think redevelopment of the Cape Cod Commission obviously talked about a redevelopment for Cape Cod, like Airbnb is like the problem almost, combating that. And so every region has its own sort of thing. But absolutely. And I think just in addition to the training, I think it's also worth recognizing that, in some cases, redevelopment authorities have been operating in past decades. And so in Taunton's case, there's like decades of projects that have been done. And I'm not necessarily getting a binder full of everything you need to know about this. So, literally this past weekend, I just found an easement that the TRA has, like just, out of the blue. And so it's just, finding it in the registry of deeds. But I think kind of really making sure that redevelopment authorities have continuity over time, because I think if you're kind of just having a redevelopment authority that's like every 5 years, it's completely changing, you completely lose the value of the redevelopment authority, because it is working on these multi-decade kind of projects. Yep.
Tom, you want to get in on this? And I didn't want to open it up to the folks in the room for questions.
Well, I was going to make sure we went back and did talk about the financial piece.
Okay.
Because it is really key. Building housing is expensive. And even though we have a strong balance book, we can do a project or two with that to build housing, especially dense housing. So using resources, public resources, to leverage private development resources, I think is really key. It's something mass development, I think, specializes in. And that's where we can take whatever investment money we can get and stretch it to build as much housing as we can build.
All right, I want to open up to the audience. Now, I understand that there's microphones in the ceiling that will pick people up for the online listeners, but I'm hoping that people will be able to hear us in the room. So if you have a question, use your outdoor voice and project. Standing in the back, and if you could identify yourself too.
Sure. Craig Lace, I'm from the city of Worcester. I run the Worcester Business Development Corporation, and we're a private nonprofit real estate development company that are not versed in expertise in housing, but we were asked by the city, all hands on deck, to help with the housing crisis. So it's new to us. Just some initial observations. I have taken a lot of property by eminent domain when I worked for the city and the redevelopment authority. There needs to be some kind of discussion about their biggest power is the assembly of the property. Two ways to assemble: take by eminent domain, and risk a pro tanto court battle or settle based on two appraisals. I'm having trouble making the leap from how that's going to be effective with solving the housing issue in terms of the capital stack. And I would just say, be a little funny, the value in Worcester is much different than the value in Cambridge. And that's an important point to make, because when you figure out the capital stack, we're like a Big Mac where Cambridge might be a cheeseburger. It's complicated and it takes a lot of time. So we've, excuse me, we've dubbed the term, it doesn't feel like a crisis when we're in meetings trying to figure out how to put historic tax credits with HDIP, with YTEC, with all of the alphabet soup of very, very complicated, of which you have to hire a consultant to figure that out, and it costs money. You have to figure out the state historic tax credit process if it's a historic building and converting 300 units. And now we have the conversion credit. All of those are capped. We have a bond cap over the entire bonding authorization that was allowed under the Housing Act, which we're grateful for. But when you start to wean all that down and figure out the speed and time to market, it doesn't feel like a crisis. And there's some bold things that I think have been discussed here that really need to be examined with respect to all of this file sub-bid, the process in which you get a historic tax credit out of the state by applying round after round after round. And in the meantime, the real estate deal falls apart and we're not creating the housing. The other piece the other observation, if you're doing 40 units and you're using the whole alphabet soup and you're doing 300 units, it's the same process. For 40 units, we have a bunch of projects. They're great projects, 16 units, 14 units. We're not even scratching the surface. So I guess what I'm saying is there needs to be some type of an incentive to incentivize the private market, and not just in terms of trust them in terms of getting the unit number, the counts of unit numbers up so that we can move quicker into creating larger projects, more housing, and also in areas that want it. Worcester wants the housing.
Well, it sounds like we should have had you on the panel too. So I appreciate all those perspectives. There's a lot you put on the table there. I don't know if there's anybody in the panel who wants to pick out
one item on eminent domain, because I think the study touched on it. Gina, public housing authorities don't need local approval it's only your board, right, for eminent domain? But RAs do have to go through a more rigorous process of their renewal plan. And so like at the time of the eminent domain, you don't have to go to the city council, but a priori you do have to. And so if your property's on the plan, and this goes to your point, right? Like, how are you saying that my property is blighted? And so now it's on a plan, and it could be there and nothing happens to it over 5 years, but essentially you're going through a political process and a hearing process. And I'm sure our friends from the city council, is not a great process to go through, right? Like, if you don't have to nod or say no. Blink twice if you're in but like, just leave it to the authority to decide like where is a good place to do housing. And so I think that's one place where it would make it easier to say like housing is a crisis, to your point, right? Like, can we give RAs the same level of power and oversight that housing authorities do if we're going to do that?
A question for Tom on the demonstration projects. Do they require city council? Because the demonstration project is sort of a novel approach that I don't know if we've really fully discussed.
It's a novel approach, and the rules are a little vague. So we have used a demonstration plan using city property where we did go to city council, but not necessarily if we're not involving a transaction with the city. And I would just say on the eminent domain component, I mean, eminent domain's a tool of last resort, and certainly the threat of eminent domain is often very key. I think even just having a little bit more flexibility to work in the real estate market like a private actor would be helpful. So rather than having to go through a 30B RFP process to find a good housing site, working with brokerage community and so forth, to like just have a little bit more flexibility about procurement, not with eminent domain, but just procurement on the market.
Yeah, just to add quickly to that, when we talk with clients, when we talk with the communities, eminent domain, last resort, expensive, time consuming, potentially land you in court. These are things that we don't like. But if the acquisition powers allows the redevelopment authority to accept grants, gifts, get transfers from the city, although your point about tax title is something we've certainly been discussing. Buy on the open market, work with the developer to assemble in other ways. But eminent domain is a powerful tool that they do have. But agree with you that last resort demonstration projects are also interesting. We're working on one now. It's been a fascinating process. Love to talk to you more about that.
So one of the things we heard too in the interviews was that certainly the power of eminent domain is a place where the trust issue comes in, right? And how it was used in the past. And I think for a host of reasons, legal, not the least of which folks are reluctant to use it. Yet, having that as a little tool there on the side is helpful in negotiations to be able to say that we do have this option. And I think one of the things that cities face is that there's often land, it's not necessarily blighted, but it's underused. There was the market basket you showed in Somerville that was, empty for 15 years is a case of a really valuable piece of land that the public would like to see put into use. So I think this is an area for study in some sense as we think about reinvigorating our redevelopment authorities is these powers of land acquisition. Because if you're going to go and say, okay, you can do it anywhere in the city, that becomes kind of a big power to be able to say, I can use my power of eminent domain anywhere. So there's probably lots of reasons people wouldn't like that. On the other hand, if there are powers of negotiation, powers you can act. So I think that's an area where I think we're just putting on the table. We got to think about this, but there's good public reasons why you should have those powers, and also good reasons why you want to make sure they're really curtailed.
Yeah.
I do want to say that I was told to make sure that people know the video will be posted, and I do want to get some more questions from the audience. And I appreciate the comments, but if we can keep them a little shorter so we can get some more voices in the room, that would be great. So, yes, sir, right here.
Hi, Sam Seidel, Cambridge. I'm impressed that you have so much confidence in redevelopment authorities. My impression is that the last 50 years of planning has been about tearing these kind of organizations down as opposed to building them up. I think reinventing them or reinvigorating them. So it's more of a comment than a question. I think the two things that really struck me were Tom's comment about patient capital and also in some ways acting on the market in the smaller scale, right? It's not the 1960s anymore. We don't think like that anymore. And also if it's not a negative force, the administrative power that a redevelopment authority can bring to a problem. Because if you have a small-time developer, they're lost. And if they can't do the math quickly, they're gone. But a redevelopment authority can sit for a decade on a Margaret Fuller parking lot until the actors are ready to play. And so, comment more than that.
And I think the example we had of the planning process in Lawrence and the ways in which, a redevelopment authority appropriately attuned to the idea that we're going to bring a planning capacity, but use a community process to inform that and not just have it be top down, is kind of reinvigorating of that role in that perspective. I got to go to the back of the room. David, do you have one online? Do you have a question online? And go ahead, David.
We actually have several online, and apologies, we can't get to them all, but I thought this was particularly fun. From Deb Elzinga, from Spokane, Washington.
All right, Washington State in the house.
Yeah, just to demonstrate the interest. Deb says, do panelists think there's a certain set of economic factors that will make mixed income social housing model successful? She adds, we're exploring models in our community and are working on financial modeling, but we're seeing possible obstacles in getting the right mix of incomes. Is the model, and then she continues, is the model most successful in high-cost, larger markets?
Does anybody have a perspective on that? I'll say that that in looking at this, that we haven't gotten into the details of this notion of social housing and cross subsidizing. The paper refers to models in Montgomery County, in Atlanta, in Seattle, and a lot of these places are looking at the question of saying, well, we want to have some units be affordable, some units be market. We're going to cross subsidize between those two. Obviously, it works. That cross subsidy approach works better in markets where market rents are higher. There's an organization, the Center for Public Enterprise, that has been working with a lot of these communities, that they go in, work with communities and tailor it to the specific circumstances in the market. So it is, the finances of building housing, of rents, are very market specific, and the ways in which you can, we're talking about this in some kind of more social aspect of like, oh, let's make incomes, but it's like, well, let's take a look at who's paying the mortgage and how that's happening. So I think that to answer the person's question, it is very specific by market, and it's a very American approach, I would say, to say is we're going to have 30% of units at 50% of AMI and 10% at 60% of AMI, and it does make life complicated, but it also then lets you figure out, can you pay your bills at the end of the month? Let me go in the back of the room, and I'll come to the front of the room. Yes, sir.
I'm Devin Quirk from the City of Boston, and this has been a great panel. I just wanted to make a quick comment and a question. On the comment side, I wanted to thank Chris and the team for endorsing our legislation that would reposition redevelopment authorities and give us that Chapter 149 exemption. I wanted to tell everyone that actually passed the State House last year, so we're actually very close to being able to pull this off. We just need to find a strategy for getting the Senate on board for it. So wanted to offer that to the room. If anyone has a political strategy for how to get this to the Senate, we need your help. The question I have is, you can have all the powers in the world and this can pass and it could be great, but if you don't have money, you won't be able to do much. You need money to do site acquisition, you need money to do development. So I'm wondering if the panel has any ideas around how redevelopment authorities could increase their capital.
And Devin, it's great to have you in the room. Thank you. Anybody?
Well, the TRA does not have much money, so I'm also interested in that question.
One of the tricks I learned in a cash-strapped gateway city was find other places. So this may not be applicable everywhere, but finding other places where there is money. One place where there historically is another type of entity is industrial development corporations. And for various reasons in a particular geography, you may have money standing there waiting for a big fish to come that you may want to reevaluate your community's priorities. Like, can we move? I know Taunton has some industrial projects that they've worked together on with mass development. I'm not specifically thinking of you guys. Don't worry. I'm not trying to touch your dough, but I do think that there are places that they have resources for industrial development that is stagnant, and maybe if the priority is housing, being able to be a little bit more flexible, because the money is chunky, right? When you do the sale, the deal, like there's money that maybe you can take out at the end of the deal, but you have to put it up front. And to your point, pre-development, right? Like that's the riskiest money, because you don't know if you're going to get a project at all. And even if it comes several years from now after you get the alphabet soup of things. So starting off with those pots, I think there's some there.
Yeah, I just want to add two things. One is on the financial side, 100% hear you. I think that's one of the hardest things when we're doing the planning is there's a financial plan required by state regulations that you have to put in the urban renewal plan, and figuring out the mix of grants that could possibly help with that. A lot of the ideas made up that they're going to acquire properties and sell them on to developers for some sort of fee that may or may not work. But I also want to add, so hear you on the financing problem. I also do want to add capacity, and that's to this gentleman's question here. I think I won't speak for everybody up here, but I can certainly see how redevelopment authorities can work in this. I think the capacity is why I mentioned training. Is not every redevelopment authority is at the point where they know how they can do things, that they have the pieces in place, that they can do things, that they have the confidence to do things. And so I don't want, funding is critically important, but do they have staffing? Do they have a parking garage that they've actually been getting money from for the last 20 years and it's just been building up? There are some that still manage parking garages, or used to when I did a survey about 10 years ago. Those two are going, the ability to get financing, the ability to get things done once the plan is finished are hand in hand. And that's all I wanted to say for that.
The one thing I would say is that I think that we're talking about a role for the public sector in development. And I think one of the reasons why this public ownership is important is because to the extent the public sector is successful in creating value, having some of that value captured back to flow into public purpose is really important. And I think that's what we're seeing in the extent that Cambridge has been able to benefit from what happened in Kendall Square, which happened in part because the Cambridge Redevelopment Authority helped make that happen. And Devin from the city of Boston, the same thing. This notion of the cities ought to be having a long-term view of our public interest and public value. And Devin, I don't know whether it's fair to throw the question back at you. Did you have an answer to your question?
I didn't. I turned to my first part of my question. I'd love to ask the state legislature for more help to fund these things. So if we could work that into our political strategy, that might help.
But I think, Devin's another person we should have, could have, would have had up here. But I think that Boston has, created some really important revenue sources for the city that have been really important. So we got time for one last question. You've been patient up here in the front.
Patty Nolan on the City Council in Cambridge, and Tom totally understated his role in addressing those trust issues. Focusing on the financing, is there any kind of common app discussion so that instead of having 16 different applications for all the financing, because we know money makes the difference, so that you don't have to do the LIHTC funding and the LISC funding and the bank funding and the private sector funding and the redevelopment authority funding, and taking all those funders and having them have more flexibility in how they'll approve it, so that you can do a mixed income housing and still get LIHTC for part of it, so that you can do an historical rehabilitation and have the historic do part of the funding, and you can have the climate resilience people do part of the funding, because that's really how we bring it together. But the amount of time spent on those 16 different ways that you approach it and put the funding together, we all know that also adds 10 to 20% of the cost just in time and funding. So just curious about how that's working.
So there is a housing one-stop application that centralizes many of the housing support programs. There's a joke at the end of this. Or maybe at the beginning, there's an economic development one-stop as well. I think it's funny because you have two one-stops, so it sounds like two stops, right? But because they're organized for somewhat different purposes, right? But there is always like some overlap. So for example, in the One Stop for Growth under the economic development bucket, we run some programs through contract with the state, including the underutilized properties program. So that could be for housing or not for housing. Many times it is. So there has been in recent years substantial streamlining of those things. It's also important to recognize that there is so much streamlining that you can do because there's different, in the sense that there are different points in the development continuum for which you need different products, different timing, right? So there are pre-development products that you may have when you don't know what the product is, and you won't know what else you need until later on. And then when you're coordinating, to your point, leveraging the public dollar with private dollars and investment, and that's more on a rolling basis, right? So whether it's conduit financing through mass development or through mass housing, then you're kind of meeting the market right at the time when you have to close on these things. So it's a point well taken. I think a lot of folks have been trying to consolidate as much as possible, but it is within limitations just because different projects are under different chronologies.
Anybody else have anything to?
I just have to add, again, totally different, but I think it relates, is, thinking about public ownership of assets that are valuable to the entire community. In Massachusetts, we have about 40 municipal utilities. Taunton is one of them. And if you ask anyone who lives in a municipal utility district whether they want to go move somewhere else and pay Eversource rates or something like that, they'll say absolutely not, because the electric rates are so low. And so it's different. Obviously, it's different, but the reason why municipal utilities are able to provide lower electric rates is because there isn't a profit incentive in the stewardship of the asset. So I think it applies also to this conversation, because if a redevelopment authority is the long-term owner of a property, there isn't necessarily the drive from a board of directors to maximize profit. It's how can we make the best use of this for the community.
And I think your question is in many ways spot on in terms of the problem that's being tried to solve here. The gentleman from Worcester in the back of the room describing this complex capital stack, and it's complexity that adds to the cost of the transaction. It's also the overall cost of capital ends up being high, because even if there's some parts of that are concessionary, there's other parts that are getting very high rates. And again, looking at these examples from across the pond, one of the virtues of their social housing systems is a simple, low-cost capital stack. And a key part is exactly what John was just talking about, is that a key part of the capital stack is public equity, where the return is not X%. The return is affordable housing and all these other kind of social contributions we're talking about. It's kind of a bigger conversation than I know maybe the city of Cambridge will be able to think about how to do this, but how do you get a source of capital, probably, importantly, public capital that's lower cost, simpler, and makes this whole thing work better. And then you can take the powers of redevelopment authorities to assemble land and do these things and put them to use. So
I'll hate myself if I don't bring it up at this point, because the Healy administration has started experimenting with this. There's now a momentum fund hosted in Mass Housing to do that type of, I think what you're getting at, right? Like the equity investment into a project that then can recycle over time, like when it gets refinanced, which often happens like at the closing of the project or soon after. So like it can recycle and they can invest equity into it.
Yeah, last comment here, and then I'll go turn it over to Gita to close us out. But last comment, question?
So I'm Kathleen Evans from Mass Housing, building on the Momentum Fund. The problem with it, though, is that it takes so long, right? So we're making a 10-year equity investment, which will pay a coupon and we'll get the full investment back. But that's a 10-year horizon to be able to reinvest that. This is the kind of thing that hopefully in 50 years, we've invested enough in that we have the stream to do a full, and even that piece, we're only 30% of the equity investment. We still need that private equity in the LIHTC deals. We still need the LIHTC equity to come in.
Want middle income.
Well, they do, but the thing is that we in Mass Development can issue the tax exempt bonds. We can't price your debt on your construction debt. We can't price your equity. We really are still at the whims of the capital market. So even if we have, and we also have, there's another one-stop coming for climate funding. So it's really great. It could be even better. But we can only sort of coalesce the things that are under that umbrella.
I just add, we're just starting a project where we're doing the construction cost financing, which is a key part of the cost. It's short term, and so hopefully we'll get that back when the project is done and we can find another project to invest it in. It's a big chunk, so you can't do it for giant projects and you can't do it for every project.
Doing like a subordinate construction piece.
No, we're doing the whole thing. No, just we'll talk.
All right, so I just saw that the jargon giraffe symbol go up. We're getting way into the weeds of housing finance here, but we do also have to bring this to a close. So I want to invite up Gita Pradhan from the Cambridge Community Foundation, who is one of our generous supporters for this project. And as she's coming up, I just want to say thank you to the panelists. My last thing is just to say that the housing affordability challenges we face in this country are so widespread and such a big scale. We need a lot of solutions. This is not one solution, not one entity, but I think we need to be looking at all the tools in the toolkit. And this is what redevelopment authority is an important tool. But Gita, I'll pass it on to you.
Thank you. So I had the hardest job. I'm between you all and the glass of wine and interesting conversations. So I'm going to do the smart thing. I'm just going to say, let's give this panel another big hand. Thank everyone, those on who joined us remotely, as well as everyone in the room, and to say that fundamentally it comes down to a novice like me, a very simple thing. There's a huge need for housing. And there's a huge need to build the social cohesion of our communities, which makes social housing a very important thing. And so you all have a really important task ahead of you. You've got to make this happen. And with that, thank you, everyone, and enjoy your conversation.